no idea. No, I'm just kidding. When we took the Christmas decorations down, we saw how plain it looked, and we are trying some different things with color. So if you absolutely love it, write that down on a sheet and put it in the offering box. If you absolutely hate it, I'll give you Pastor Chris's email, and you can talk to him. We're going to be painting the sanctuary actually a week from tomorrow. So that's always an interesting time. Change is always interesting, but anyway, we'll leave it at that. All right, so we're going to go to Luke's Gospel. We continue to work our way through the Gospel of Luke, and we're going to be talking about this is the one who is great. What is true greatness? Chuck Colson knows something about this subject because he hobnobbed with some very elite people in Washington, D.C. Many of you know Chuck's story that in the Watergate scandal, he ended up falling because of what happened, and he ended up in prison. And he started a prison ministry that's really impacted many, many people. And he writes this in one of his books. He said, I vividly recall a glimpse from my White House days. One brisk December night, as I accompanied the president from the Oval Office in the West Wing of the White House to the residence. Mr. Nixon was musing about what people wanted in their leaders. He slowed a moment, looking into the distance across the South Lawn, and said, quote, the people really want a leader a little bigger than themselves, don't they, Chuck? I agreed. I mean, someone like de Gaulle, he continued. There's a certain aloofness, a power that's exuded by great men that people feel and want to follow. That, of course, was before Colson's humbling at Watergate and his subsequent encounter with Jesus Christ. And because of that, Colson goes on to say, Jesus Christ exhibited none of the self-conscious aloofness. He served others. He spoke to those to whom no one spoke. He dined with the lowest members of society. He touched the untouchables. He had no throne, no crown, no bevy of servants or armored guards. A borrowed manger and a borrowed tomb framed his earthly life. Kings and presidents and prime ministers surround themselves with minions who rush ahead, swing the doors wide, and stand at attention as they wait for the great to pass by. But Jesus said that He Himself stands at the door and knocks, patiently waiting to enter our lives. And then this thought from R. Kent Hughes. Colson is absolutely right. True greatness is the antithesis or opposite of pride and exclusivity. I think when we grow in this world, we tend to admire a certain power that people can project, a certain aloofness. Maybe we can't get to those people, you know. It's hard to get to certain people and really get to know them. And they seem to spend their lives in the ivory tower. I had one gentleman tell me one time that many pastors seem to live in an ivory tower. They give birth to their sermon every Sunday and go back into their ivory tower. They seem to be so distant from people, so aloof. That is not true leadership. True leadership spends time in the trenches, and as we look at the Gospel of Luke, we find that Jesus Christ has been training leaders. He's been training the 12 to carry on the gospel. He's been modeling true leadership. He's been modeling true greatness. True greatness is not aloofness. It's not a celebrity status where everybody thinks you're all that, because anybody who spends time with any individual will soon find out that we all have feet of clay. We're all weak. We're all in process. We all need the help of Almighty God to be what He's called us to be. And we're all discovering that as we go on in our lives. It's been intriguing to watch the phenomenon of Tim Tebow. And many of you who have been watching the Denver Broncos kind of move through this season have realized that it came to an end yesterday. Yes, the Patriots beat the Denver Broncos. But the week before, many of you know that I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan from the time I was small. They beat my Steelers. And I have to tell you, I was genuinely torn about that game because I've been rooting for Tim Tebow, but I've been a longtime Steelers fan. But I was really happy to see that victory. And so he came up to the podium after the victory, and you know, they probably interviewed him for 20 minutes. Everybody's intrigued by this guy and asked him all kinds of different questions. And one thing that he said in that interview is that he had spent his pregame time and he was planning to go hang out with a girl who had had close to 70 surgeries. She has a disease, it's a rare disease that eats away at your tissue. And CBS did a story at yesterday's game where they showed the girl, and she was just genuinely in awe of what Tebow does for her. Her face is sunken. It looks like they've had to do surgeries on her nose, and she's been through a ton of stuff, I think, since she was 6 years old. And Tebow was at the podium, and he said, you know, our greatest victory today, speaking of last week's victory, was not the football game. It was spending time with this young lady. And then they did a little bit more of a story and showed another young man that he spends time with. These are people that you couldn't imagine a pro athlete, you know, getting the celebrity status and preparing for a big game would ever spend time with people like this. But that's what he did. And it was intriguing to people to see this kind of thing come out in a person. They don't know what quite to make of it. But that's his heart. And that's really the heart of a Christian. The heart of a Christian is going to be great when it becomes like its Savior. That's what God is doing in your life, by the way. He is trying to make you more like Jesus Christ. And as we watch Jesus go through the Gospels, he did indeed spend time with unexpected people. He did spend time with the outcasts. He did touch the untouchables. He was a man who spent time trying to reach out to seek and save the lost. And if we are going to be like him, we must do the same. We must get rid of this idea of what greatness is about and have a new definition of what God calls greatness. Because when it's all said and done, that's the only thing that's going to matter. Have I done great things in the sight of my God, or have people thought I'm great? That's really what you're going to have to decide in your life. And it's not an easy decision, especially when you gain a measure of success in this world. You have to really guard yourself. And so Luke chapter 9 is the text. We're only going to look at a few verses this morning. Luke 9, we'll go to verse 50, and we'll start in verse 46. Let me set the stage for a moment. The timing is that Jesus has summed up his Galilean ministry. That's Luke 9:51. We'll jump ahead for a moment. This will be next Sunday. It came about, this is Luke 9:51, when the days were approaching for Jesus' ascension, that he resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem. So for those of you who are interested, from Luke 9:51 to Luke 19:27 is the trip from Galilee, or Capernaum specifically, to Jerusalem. So this is his final movement from the north to the south as he's going resolutely to face the cross. And so what's happened in the backdrop, and if you've been with us, you've been following along with it. Peter, James, and John have just gone up to the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus was transfigured before them. He was glorified. He literally, the word kavod, speaking of glory or weightiness, he opened the door within. He showed who he was. We could say it in one way. He showed God's true nature. In another way, maybe God's true heart. And there they were, beaming and basking in the afterglow of that experience. Remember, only 3 of them had gone up. The 9 had stayed at the bottom of the mountain. And they had bottomed out at the bottom of the mountain. Because what took place is that when they came down from the mountain, remember, they encountered a demon-possessed boy, a desperate father, and 9 apostles who had lost their power. They had lost their connection to God. They were prayerless. They believed in formulas. They somehow had lost the presence of God moving powerfully in their life. And they couldn't do anything for this boy. And Jesus expressed his exasperation with the condition. The people saw Jesus. Mark 9:15 says, when they saw him, they ran up to him. They were greatly amazed. He may have still been shining from that mountaintop experience. But he came down and he saw the pride of his apostles, the self-reliance that they were demonstrating. And he saw them fail. And so he said, bring the boy to me. I'll take care of this situation. And here's what happened. He touched the boy. This is end of verse 42. He healed him. He gave him back to his father. That's what Jesus does. He heals us and gives us back to our Father. And they were all amazed. I want you to note this, Bible students. At the what? The greatness of God. Everyone, including the 12, who there was some measure of failure on the mountaintop when Peter was rebuked, if you will, by the voice of the Father. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. They came down from the mountain to the failure of the 9 that had been left there. but when Jesus stepped in, they were all amazed, look at 43, at the greatness of God. They were, but while everyone was marveling at all that he was doing, and then he's going to share some words about his coming death in Jerusalem to his disciples. And so the thought resonating in everybody's mind, including the 12, was, God is great. God is great. God is great. Have you ever been there before? Have you ever had a mountaintop experience, or maybe even an experience in the valley, where God came through for you, and all that kept going through your mind was, God is great. Our God is great. But something happened. They went from God is great to I am great. I am great. And you all know that it's not hard to do that. It's not hard, seemingly in a microsecond, to go from God is great to I am great. And that's what happened to them. That's exactly what we are going to encounter, is a group of disciples who all of a sudden begin to focus on themselves. Pride is our biggest hindrance to faith, and that's what Jesus has been training them about, because pride says, I've arrived. Pride says, I'm good. I can do this. Pride says, I trust me. And that's a dangerous place to be. When we are functioning in pride, we leave the surrounding fence of faith. Batak is the Hebrew word for faith. It means to be behind the surrounding fence. A place of refuge, a place of safety. But when you leave that fence, when you say, God, I'm cool, I got it now, I'll jump over the fence, I'm on my own now. That's when you are the most vulnerable. As a matter of fact, I would say you are the most hyper vulnerable when pride is flowing through you like that. You become exposed. You leave out God. You say, I got it now. And then you become vulnerable to the enemy. And that's how people fall. People think they got it. They've arrived. I can do this. And they lose a sense of the greatness of God, and they begin to focus on the greatness of themselves. In Luke 9:41, Jesus answered and said, here's the root of it, O unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here. He was exasperated at their unbelief. He knew that their pride was going to be their biggest problem. And he was handing the baton of ministry to these 12. Remember, he's telling them, I'm going to die. You're going to be the ones left here. And if you don't depend on me, if you don't depend on the power of the Holy Spirit, you're going to be in trouble. And the one thing that we know of the enemy is that he's a divider. He tries to get us to focus on ourselves. And it's all about me. And instead of them taking inventory of their failure, instead of them saying, yeah, God is great, what did I do wrong? And they did ask the question, Lord, why weren't we able? And remember, Jesus said this kind only comes out by prayer, and one manuscript version says, and fasting. And that's something we need to consider too. Because when we fast, what happens? We are elevating the things of the Spirit and pushing down our flesh. Now, if you've ever tried to fast, and I know some of you have done this regularly, you know what happens. Your flesh begins to cry out, feed me, what are you doing? And you're like, I'm changing things up. You no longer are going to rule. But I've been ruling for years. Go, drive through that restaurant. And you really have to push down your flesh. And so here's what happens. This is the backdrop. And Jesus now tells them again, look, 44, let these words sink into your ears. They're not listening. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. But they did not understand the statement. They didn't fully put it all together, apparently. It was concealed from them so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this statement. In other Gospels, he tells them, and immediately you see the argument. And it's almost as if they couldn't put it together. There was some fear there, so they said, yeah. Okay, Jesus, but I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. Okay, you're going to die and all that. Yeah. But let's talk about me now. Let's talk about my position. Right? We can easily brush things aside that way. So here is the text. And an argument, if you have the New King James, verse 46, a dispute arose among them. The word argument or disputes is dialogismos, where we get the idea of dialogue, but here it is the idea of discussion or debate. A debate arose among them, an argument among the 12 here. as to which of them might or would be the greatest. They began their competition, if you will, for position, place, prestige, prominence. Why do you think now they began to argue? Well, Peter, James, and John, remember, had been up on the mountain. And they were kind of the inner circle of the hand-picked 12. So when they come down from the mountain, the other 9 can't cast out the demon out of this boy. And so maybe they were gloating a little. Here they're saying, hey boys, I don't know what you've been doing, but we've been up on the mountaintop. And let me tell you what we saw. Well, Moses, Elijah, yeah. Well, you guys, well, you know. And obviously you're not very spiritual because you can't even cast out this demon out of this boy. You just don't have it going on. And maybe they were rubbing it in. And maybe somebody else responded and said, well, Peter, the only reason Jesus takes you places is to keep an eye on you. Because we know how much trouble you get in. Right? And maybe it started to get ugly real quick. Debating back and forth. Right? We know that James and John, who were up on that mountaintop, they were the ones that got their mom to go to Jesus and ask him, can my sons, when you come into your kingdom, and maybe they thought the kingdom, I think this was their thought, they thought the kingdom was coming quickly and it was going to be set up, so they were jockeying for position. You know what, we're going to make sure right now that, you know, we've got our place. And they began to argue, and it got very, very ugly, very, very quick. One thing, go to Mark 9. I'm going to read something from my notes. It can be very easy for us as Christians to forget where we've come from and how weak we can be. Instead of them walking away from this mighty miracle saying, I want to be more like Jesus, they walked away saying, everyone here should be more like me. I think that's what pride does to us. Mark 9, let's look at verse 33. And they came to Capernaum, Mark 9:33. And when he was in the house, he began to question them. So now we're going to find out a little bit more insight what they were discussing on the way. Apparently there was a little bit of distance between Jesus and the 12. And he knew that they were debating, but they didn't think that he was in the discussion or that he knew what was going on. So he asked them a question. Hey, fellas, what were you talking about when we were on the way? And I want you to see how childlike they could be. But they what? They kept silent. You could see the frazzled looks of the 12. The big eyes. Does he know something? I don't know. And for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. And sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be what? Last of all and servant of all. Now go to Matthew. Matthew also records this account. Matthew 18. Jesus, one of the ways that he modeled this was in John 13. You remember he washed the disciples' feet. He took the place of the lowliest slave. He showed them what true greatness was about. He said, you call me Master and Lord, and you say right, that's what I am. If I, your Master, washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. I've given you an example that you should follow in my steps. See, in those last 48 hours, he's trying to drive home the points that he's been giving to them along the way. Matthew 18, look at verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus, Matthew 18:1, and said, so they've overcome now their shyness or whatever, being confronted. Now they just ask straight out, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? We want to know. And he called a child to himself, and he set him before them. And he said, Matthew 18:3, truly I say to you, unless you are, what's your Bible say? Converted. See, without conversion, you're not going to have this kind of attitude. You can't expect an unbeliever to act this way because they don't know this. And they don't have the Spirit of God in their lives. You must be converted. Christianity is not about moralism. It's not about serving in a soup kitchen so that the cameras can get pictures of you and you can start your own foundation. True Christianity is about having the heart of Jesus Christ. And you must be converted to have His heart. You must be changed. You must become like children. And if you don't, you shall not, this is radical, enter the kingdom of heaven. Now notice this. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child, notice, in my name, receives me. Now Jesus is not saying that if you're nice to children, you become a Christian. Jesus is saying that he's giving us an illustration that a child, especially in Hebrew culture, and especially before the age of 12, represents a very lowly class. And remember, there were times when people were trying to get children to Jesus so that he might lay his hand on them and bless them. And the disciples tried to shoo them away and rebuke the people. And Jesus says, don't hinder the little children from coming to me. For to such as these belong the kingdom of heaven. Let them come. Let them come. Look, I know kids come out of the womb and they have a sinful nature. But I also know this, that there is a certain innocence, a trust about a child that is a precious, precious thing. And so Jesus says, don't hinder them. You have to be the same way. You have to humble yourself as this child. No pretense, etc. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. The point he is saying is, you are going to carry on a gospel that's going to embrace the lowly, the outcast. Have you been watching me? Have you been seeing my heart for people? That's what you're going to have to do. Receive has the idea of receiving intimately to oneself. But notice the contrast. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble. Scandalizo is the Greek word. It means to trip up. But it also is translated, I think, in the New King James, if you cause one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him that a heavy millstone be hung around his neck and that he be drowned into the depth of the sea. Think of the context. What is the context? The disciples' pride and arrogance. Pride goes before a fall. The word pride is sometimes used in the sense of a basic meaning of majesty or elevation. So there's several different words in Hebrew for pride, but one of the words has the idea of what rises or what is elevated. And pride is the elevation of self. And Jesus is saying, think of the flow of the context. If you are prideful, you're going to end up stumbling people who what? Want to come to me. And not only that, you're going to stumble yourselves. You're going to hurt one another. I read something this week about a guy who would go to a denominational pastor's meeting. And he said he would always leave that time, rather than being refreshed, he would be drained. He said because everybody was so concerned about how well they were doing, how their churches were doing, who had stumbled and what positions might be open. And he said it wasn't elevating, it wasn't edifying. It was simply competition. It wasn't God glorifying. It wasn't like we were praying for one another and saying, you know what, you're on the same team as me. Let's make sure we're covering each other and encouraging one another. It wasn't that at all. He would leave there depressed, drained, trying to put up his best face of how successful he was. That's the danger. And Jesus is saying, look, notice the flow. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, 7, Matthew 18. For it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. But woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. Don't take this literally, but you get the idea. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It's better for you to enter life with 1 eye than having 2 eyes and to be cast into the fiery hell. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually behold the face of my Father who's in heaven. And then Jesus, in the flow, Bible students, he will address us going to one another. Look at verse 12. Let's keep going because I think it's really important. What do you think? If any man has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go search for the one that is straying? If it turns out that he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 which have not gone astray. Thus, it is not the will of your Father who's in heaven that one of these little ones perish. Now, this is the famous section about if your brother sins, go to him in private. If your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. This is the same section. The foundation, the springboard of it is their pride. And Jesus trying to tell them, look out, watch out. And if you see somebody doing this, the best thing that you can do as a brother who loves somebody else is say, be careful. Don't allow your pride to get in your way. And we all need to guard that. We all need to watch out for each other. That's the point of the text. This word for great, go back to Luke's Gospel, is an interesting word. It speaks of rank. It's used in several different ways. It's used in the hierarchical structure of the Trinity. It is used about love. The greatest of these is love. It has a moral connotation. And it can also speak of rank in terms of position of people. And so they want to know who is great. And Jesus wants them to see, I want you to see who is great in God's eyes. That's really what matters. So let's go to Luke 9 and look at verse 47. But Jesus, Luke 9:47, knowing what they were thinking. That is not necessarily convenient when your thoughts are not good. Knowing what they were thinking in their heart, took a child and stood him by his side. By his side is the place of prominence or the place of honor or blessing. That's what he did. He gave them a word picture. Put the child right by his side and then began to speak to them. He knew what they were thinking. This is an aspect, by the way, of Jesus' deity. Omniscience belongs to God. Now what is that? It's two words put together. Omni and science. All. Science means knowledge. God is all what? Knowing. He knows my thought from afar. He knows what I do. He knows what I'm going to say before I speak it. And Jesus knew their thoughts. This is another indication for those of you trying to understand the nature of Jesus, that He is God. He is all-knowing. He knew their thoughts. He knew what was going on in their hearts, and that's the center of who we are. And He knew that they had been reasoning and thinking and debating about themselves. So He places this child in the place of honor. Though loved and cherished, the child was the smallest and most powerless individual in Hebrew culture. Listen to this. The Talmud regarded spending time with children to be a waste of time. One rabbi said, quote, morning sleep, midday wine, chattering with children and tearing in places where men of the common people assemble destroys a man, unquote. That was their perspective. Get these kids out of there. Until that kid turns 12 and we'll deal with the Torah and everything, we don't want to spend time with little kids. You see, it's all about the company that we keep. That's what makes us important. If we spend time with big shots and, people love this. A celebrity walks by. Can you believe, I tell you what, I don't get it, but maybe you guys get it. How starstruck people can be. And they'll spend hours to wait to get someone they can smell their cologne as they walk by. Oh yeah. And if they were to give them a piece of their clothing, even their sweatband, a pro athlete, here you go, fan. Oh, I'm going to cherish this. I'm never going to watch this again. It's great. What? But that's sometimes how we get. And so Jesus' deity is on display. And all they can display, unfortunately, is their childish thinking. I want you to turn to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians. So go towards the book of Revelation. I want to show you what the Apostle Paul says about this subject and how he ties it in with the deity of Jesus Christ. Philippians 2, verse 5. Have this attitude, Philippians 2:5, in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who although He existed in this Greek word is morphe, form of God, speaks of the nature of God. This is Philippians 2:6. He did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but He emptied Himself. This is the idea of His self-emptying, That is, setting aside the full rights of his deity, which he showed on the Mount of Transfiguration. For a season, he clothed his glory in humanity. He emptied himself, taking the morphe, the form of a bondservant. Notice he didn't come to reign in a palace, but he took the form of a bondservant, Philippians 2:7, and he was made in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And notice this word, therefore. Also God did what? Highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name. God is opposed to the proud, but he gives what? Grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under his mighty hand, that he may do what? Exalt you at the proper time. This is the kingdom of heaven. It's upside down. God says, if you humble yourself, you'll be exalted. If you exalt yourself, you will be humbled. And so we have to realize that this is what he's doing in the lives of the apostles. And he sets the little kid, go back to Luke, right by his side, the place of honor. Mark's gospel says he took the little child into his arms. He hugged the little child. He spent time with the lowly, and some commentators believe that the child was Peter's child because he's in a house in Capernaum, and that's where Peter lived. So it may have been one of Peter's kids. You know, sometimes we're tempted when one of the little rugrats runs into the room, we say, get out of here, we're doing important stuff here, kid. But have you ever noticed that sometimes children can teach us more about life than we could imagine? Sometimes we want to dismiss that. Sometimes we want to dismiss a word from someone we think to be less important so that we can hear the pearls of wisdom from the really important person. Sometimes we can pass by maybe the greatest lessons of our lives because we don't want to slow down for them. Because we think, no, I don't have time for that. That's unimportant. And so sometimes you get involved in a situation, you get your hands dirty a little bit, You realize where someone is, the difficulty that they're going through, and God teaches you more there than he would have taught you in listening to 50 sermons. You know what I'm saying? That's what Jesus' point is. He took the child in his arms. He put the child in the place of honor, and he said these words. This is Luke 9:48. He said to them, whoever receives this child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me, receives him who sent me. That's his Father. For he who is least among you, this is the one who is great. The word receive means to accept by deliberate and ready reception of what is offered. Think of the backdrop of the church. They're going to go out. They're going to have to receive Gentiles, which was a difficult thing for the Jewish mind. The church is going to be this amalgamation of people from every tribe, tongue, nation, and people. They're going to be the leaders. And Jesus is saying, look, you've got to understand what's going to happen here. And you're not seeing it right now, but the walls are going to completely come down in the church. And in order for the church to be a witness to the world, it cannot be segregated. It cannot have the same competitive spirit and battles that the world has, because the world won't know about the gospel, that we're different, that I want to receive them to myself. That where I am, there they may be also, unless we understand this issue. This is greatness. You must receive Jesus to receive the Father. And Jesus is saying one of the key aspects of people who know me is they will receive others. You know that you've passed from death to life because what? You love God's people. That's 1 John. You can know, 1 John 3:14, that you've passed from death to life because you love God's people. So sometimes you talk to people and you say, oh, you don't go to church? No. Why not? Well, because this, or that. How can we say we love God whom we have not seen if we can't love one another whom we have seen? There's something wrong. And so John, verse 49, who was one of the ones up on the mountain, and I hope you're back in Luke now, Luke 9:49. And John answered and said, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name. And I think John is making a confession in light of what he's just heard. Maybe he feels a little bit of conviction. He says, Lord, I want to share something with you. We saw someone casting out demons in your name, and what did we do? We tried to hinder him, Luke 9:49, because he does not follow along with us. He's not one of us. He was going around in your name. He seems to be legitimate, not like one of these phonies. And he was doing stuff in your name, and we said, hey, you! Don't be using that name. Don't you know who we are? We're the 12. Handpicked, 3 of us were just up on the mountain. Okay? I don't know if you have a business card. I don't know where you're from. I don't know if you knew what's going on here. But we're the 12. And they apparently tried to hinder him. And I think John wanted to share this with the Lord. I think he wanted to maybe come clean and say, Lord, this is what happened. And Jesus said to him, 50, do not hinder him, for he who is what? Not against you is for you. Jesus seems to legitimize what this guy is doing. Jesus seems to be saying, you don't know everything. He has a relationship with me. Don't try to hinder him. Now, Jesus would never say to one of his apostles, correct them if they were trying to hinder a false teacher. We see that in our Bible. But here this guy seems to be genuinely trying to do the work of the Spirit. And they tried to hinder him. Now, I'm going to show you some various texts and we're done. Go to the book of Numbers. Numbers, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Go to chapter 11. So Moses had a pretty important position, obviously leading God's people. I want to show you something that happens here. This is Numbers 11:23. So the Lord's getting ready to send meat to the whining children of Israel. This is Numbers 11:23. And the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. Numbers 11:24. So Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord. Also he gathered 70 men of the elders of the people and stationed them around the tent. Then the Lord, Numbers 11:25, came down in the cloud and spoke to him. And he took up the Spirit who was upon him and placed him upon the 70 elders. And it came about that when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, but they did not do it again. But 2 men had remained in the camp, 26. The name of one of them was Eldad, and the name of the other was Medad. And the Spirit rested upon them. Now they were among those who had been registered but had not gone out to the tent. And they prophesied in the camp. So a young man ran and told Moses and said, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And then Joshua, the son of Nun, the attendant of Moses from his youth, answered and said, Moses, my Lord, restrain them. But Moses said to him, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. And then, if you look at Numbers 12, I want you to see something in verse 3. Now the man Moses, Numbers 12:3, this is in parentheses, was very humble, more than what? Any man who was on the face of the earth. That's leadership. Look, we need people to be preaching the gospel. Paul's in a Philippian jail. And he knows that there's some people celebrating his imprisonment who are preaching the gospel out of envy. But they seem to be at least accurately preaching the gospel. And he said, look, some people may do it out of envy. Some people may preach out of goodwill. But the thing that I'll rejoice in is that Jesus Christ is being preached. He's not talking about a false gospel. He corrects that in Galatians 1. But he's saying, look, if the motive of people are wrong, I can't control that. But one thing I do know, I will rejoice wherever the genuine gospel is proclaimed. Because we're on the same team. And that's the point of the passage. Don't hinder those who are doing the work. And then in John 3, I'll just summarize it for you a second. John the Baptist has to decrease. And people are flocking to the apostles and to Jesus. And his concerned apostles say, or his disciples, John's that is, say, he's baptizing more than you. And all these people are coming to you. And John says, look, this was my purpose. I'm paraphrasing. I came to introduce the bridegroom. I have to decrease. He has to increase. A man would have nothing unless it what? Been first given to him from heaven. whatever you have right now, whatever your gifts are, every gift is from the Holy Spirit. Whatever your financial status may be, your relationships, whatever you celebrate in your life, whatever you can accomplish in ministry, remember, it's been first given to you from heaven. Whatever physical gifts you possess, how you look, what you can do athletically, musically, leadership skills or otherwise, are all a gift from God. And if you want to be great, if you want to be someone who really stands out in this culture, don't follow their idea of greatness. Their idea of greatness is accolades for self. It's all about self-promotion and self. There's even a magazine called Self. I wonder what that says. It's dealing with my favorite subject, after all. Right? And Jesus says, no, I have come to serve, not to be served, and to give my life, what? As a ransom for many. I've come to lay down my life. And because Jesus honored his Father, he was elevated, what? To the highest place. If you want to be elevated, if you want to be great in God's eyes. That's all that really matters. Whatever it is that you do, whether you have a platform and you teach and speak to people, or whether it is God has given you a gift of mercy or hospitality, whatever it is, do all things, what? To the glory of God. That's the key. And we will be like our Master. Father, we want